The new UK government sets out its plans with big focus on its ailing economy. On foreign policy, it wants better EU relations, while backing and arming Ukraine will continue. So, what can be expected from Keir Starmer's government? And what change on issues like the war on Gaza? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Dareen Abughaida. With the pomp and ceremony of royalty opening the UK Parliament at Westminster, the new Labour government has now set out its legislative plans with economic growth as its priority. Brexit and high fuel costs, in part due to the Ukraine war, have helped drive a cost of living crisis, with many struggling to make ends meet. The new Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, takes over after a landslide victory earlier this month that ended 14 years of Conservative government. So the electorate wanted change. But what can we expect from the new government? And with the UK involved in the wars in Gaza and Ukraine, what changes, if any, can we expect on foreign policy? We'll get to our guests in a moment. First, this report from Imogen Kimber.
My Lords and members of the House of Commons.
The King's speech, marking the official opening of the newly elected UK Parliament.
My government will govern in service to the country. My government's legislative programme will be mission-led and based upon the principles of security, fairness and opportunity for all. Stability will be the cornerstone of my government's economic policy, and every decision will be consistent with its fiscal rules.
Prime Minister Keir Starmer says the plans laid out in the speech, which is written by the government, will take the brakes off Britain.
I do solemnly, sincerely, truly declare and affirm.
His Labour government has been elected with a whopping majority of 174, ousting the Conservative Party, which has been in power for 14 years.
Look, colleagues, it is absolutely fantastic to welcome you.
There are more than 35 new proposed laws, and at the top of the agenda is economic growth. One of those bills is building more houses, although some question the plan. There are proposals to renationalise the railways, which were privatised under the Conservatives 3 decades ago, but have seen services decline.
Morning, Prime Minister.
But in foreign policy, dramatic changes are not expected.
How are you going to pay for all this?
Starmer waited 4 months until February before calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. He's purged his party of supporters of former leader Jeremy Corbyn, who is a strong supporter of Palestinian political and human rights demands.
We'll search for peace, not war.
Half of the new government has taken funding from pro-Israeli lobby groups, and some are members of the Labour Friends of Israel group, such as the new foreign minister. Days after his appointment, he travelled to Israel and the occupied West Bank.
I'm using all diplomatic efforts. Indeed, last week with the G7 nations, and particularly with Tony Blinken pressing for that hostage deal. And I hope too that we see a ceasefire.
Support for Ukraine and its fight against Russia will be, quote, unwavering. But one area of difference may be the EU. The new PM has said he cannot roll back Brexit, but he can push for closer ties with Europe. But whatever plans are made, the difficult part will be to implement them. Imogen Kimber, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Okay, let's now bring in our guests. Joining us all from the UK, we have in London, Lucy Fisher, who's a Whitehall editor at the Financial Times and the host of the Political Fix podcast and an author. In Eastbourne, we have Tim Bale, who's a professor of politics at Queen Mary University in London. And also in London is Peter Geoghegan, who's a political commentator and Sunday Times bestselling author of the book Democracy for Sale. Thank you so much for your time with us on Inside Story. Peter, I'll start with you first. When you look at the scale and the challenges that the UK faces, did this speech meet the needs of the British people?
I think that's kind of the big question people are going to be asking on the back of this. He did touch on the big themes of the general election and the big themes if you talk to voters. Things like health, things like transport and particularly housing. It's a King's speech, so what you've got is very much an outline of these 35 bills. It's not clear in some areas what exactly we're going to be looking at, but what we can see and what's very clearly signalled is a much more interventionist state than we've seen in the past. We've had 14 years of Conservative government, which ended in a record defeat for the Conservative Party. And in some respects, Labour is setting itself up, Keir Starmer is setting himself up and saying, I want to be much more interventionist. The big issue, and the big issue is flagged in your packages, and someone shouted at Keir Starmer, is where is the money going to come from? We know that the British economy is in a weak place and the public finances are in a bad position. And what's not clear, I think, coming out of this King's speech is exactly how, beyond supply side changes, this government are going to address that.
Okay, got it. Important point you raised there. Lucy, let me ask you, what you think the aim was of the speech, and was it achieved?
Well, look, I think it was twofold. Firstly, to show the scale of his ambition, to get started on some of the most difficult missions in his government, including the one at the centre of it all, that mission for driving economic growth in order to pay for many of the things he wants to do. As Peter pointed out, people are already asking where the money is going to come from. And the big measure today, the big bill announced, was on planning reforms to get house building and infrastructure building going. I think also what you've seen is a slew of bills that will allow him to tick off some easy wins. The last government, a lot of polling showed voters felt that there was a huge level of incompetence. They weren't living up to their pledges. So he'll be wanting to get going on ticking off some of those manifesto vows. And that's why I'm not surprised he also carried over a number of bills from the last Tory administration, Rishi Sunak's smoking ban, and various other plans for a new football regulator that will allow him to chalk up those easy wins and show that he's governing in the national interest and not taking a partisan or tribal approach to good policy.
Okay, let's drill down into some of these sort of key takeaways. Tim, when it comes to planning reforms to get the country to build more houses and infrastructure, how key was that, do you think?
Oh, vitally important. I mean, one of the huge problems we have in this country is a housing market that really does not serve the population, and particularly young people. It's absolutely vital that we build more homes. I'm not so sure, as perhaps the government is, that building more will necessarily see a big fall in prices. But nevertheless, we have to do something to meet demand by increasing supply. So that is hugely important. And of course, there is a multiplier effect. Once we start building more, presumably then we will get more people into employment, although that's going to be difficult given that we already have quite high employment rates. Presumably it will also have a knock-on effect on wages as well. So that will mean there is more spending done by people in the economy. So it could establish a virtuous circle. That's what the government hopes anyway.
And Peter, when it comes to the issue of enshrining into law the ability of the fiscal watchdog to assess every big fiscal event, I mean, how significant is that?
Well, this is really a signal to the kind of sense in which the Labour Party are still going to be campaigning in government, is what senior Labour people have said. This is really, in many ways, about Liz Truss, the Conservative leader before Rishi Sunak, very short-lived, quite disastrous Conservative leader, who was a huge theme of Labour's massive election-winning campaign, that Liz Truss should crash the economy. Liz Truss clashed a lot with the OBR. And in kind of what they're kind of doing with this, I think this is more symbolic than anything else, really, but it's quite powerful symbolism all the same.
Let me ask Tim then, or pardon me, I'll go to Lucy first. Lucy, the other announcement we heard was nationalising the railway, but that is a pledge that Labour made on the campaign trail, saying that they will fully nationalise the train network within 5 years of coming to power. And I suppose now comes the difficult bit, actually trying to deliver this. How difficult is it going to be, do you think?
Actually, it sounds like it's a huge disruption to the way that the rail services are currently run in the UK. But I think for the most part, Labour is trying to smartly, shift services onto the state's books as and when contracts come to an end, to avoid a huge sort of upset, or to avoid the kind of costs that come with nationalising other utilities, which they say would just be, bad value for money for the taxpayer. But of course, in the politics of this, it is a sop to the left of the party when Labour have moved away from some of the other issues that look very tricky to deliver that were demanded by the left. I think one area where there's a big question mark left is on what the final package of workers' rights looks like. Labour has today announced it's introducing a bill on that front. A lot of that is going to go out to consultation, but there are members of the trade union movement and some on the left flank of the party who are a little suspicious that some measures that are resisted or opposed by big business may yet be jettisoned by the new government.
Tim, was there anything not included that you wanted to see?
Well, whether I wanted to see it or not is possibly irrelevant, but I think certainly some fans of democracy in this country did want to see Labour initially put through a bill to reduce the voting age to 16, for example. I think they wanted to see automatic voting registration. I think they would have liked to have seen Labour go further on House of Lords reform. As it is, what Labour is intending to do is to get rid of the remaining hereditary peers in the House of Lords, so people who are there simply because they are born in the aristocracy, and also introduce a mandatory retirement age for some peers in order to get the numbers in the House of Lords down. Of course, many people would argue that in the 21st century, in a democracy like Britain, we really shouldn't be in a situation where one House of Parliament is appointed rather than elected. There are many people on the Labour side who believe that, but the Labour government has said that any progress on that is for the future. I think they probably will introduce votes at 16. That's something that's been a policy for some time, and they will introduce automatic voter registration, but they say that there's plenty of time to do that. And to be honest, I think Labour probably has got at least 4 or 5 years. There's no danger of this government collapsing anytime soon.
Right. But Peter, did the speech manage to convince you that the campaign promises are actually being turned into reality, or at least the process is beginning? Because government plans and then government achieving something are completely different.
Well, the Labour Party wasn't elected on a hell of a lot of promises. There wasn't a lot of promises in the Labour manifesto, as was. It was quite a thin document. There was a lot of talk of change, but there wasn't a lot of meat on the bones. So what we've seen today, there's not a huge amount that's massively surprising. Quite a lot was flagged beforehand. The challenge, I think, for Labour is less about specific policies from the election campaign and more how to actually change the standards of living for people in the United Kingdom. Real wages haven't really increased at all over the last 15 years. The long tail of austerity is still felt in the United Kingdom, and there's quite a lot of dissatisfaction with politics as is, and the scale of Labour's victory really does also reflect the first past the post system we have in the United Kingdom, where it's kind of winner takes all. So Labour did very well, but a lot of that vote was very much an anti-conservative vote, punishing the Conservatives for what was widely seen, especially towards the end of their administration, as incompetence. But the challenge for Labour is actually going to be delivering something that people will feel is a tangible difference, and that they will also thank Labour for at the end of it, which isn't easy.
Tim, there's some comparison being made between this policy that was put forward, these laws that are going to be enacted, and what Tony Blair said back in 1997, where he actually introduced a national minimum wage, a windfall tax on privatised utilities, referendums on devolution in Scotland and Wales, and also independence for the Bank of England, as you know. So is it more restrained this time around? And is Starmer pursuing a more cautious approach? Is that a strategy?
No, I think if you lay out those 1997 policies on the part of Tony Blair, they look quite impressive. But I think if you looked into and summarised these 40 proposals by the Labour government in 2024, probably you could pick out some which were just as impressive. Actually, the Labour government in 1997 was very cautious for the first few years, and indeed some Labour politicians said that they wished they'd taken more advantage of the huge majority that they had back then. I think what Peter says is incredibly important. The Labour government has to be seen to deliver on some of the things that people felt were very, very important in this election, and which aren't really to do with legislation. They are to do, quite frankly, with resources that need to be diverted into our crumbling public services. Now, that's something that a King's speech isn't really going to talk very much about, but it's actually, in the end, probably what is going to help Labour win a second term, in particular, obviously, money for the National Health Service. And that, as you've already alluded to, in some ways is part of the challenge that Labour faces, because at the moment, people are asking where the money is going to come from. And it's very difficult to believe that unless if they keep to their fiscal rules, they find other forms of tax revenue, they're going to be able to do that. That isn't really something that's dealt with in this King's speech. It wouldn't really be dealt with in any legislative programme, but it's something that the government is going to have to do pretty soon, I think.
Lucy, weigh in on this. I mean, Peter and Tim rightly point out that this is according to research and polls coming out of the UK, that after the election, people felt that delivery was lacking by the last government. So how much pressure is Starmer under to deliver right now? And is his agenda dominated by more of a gradual approach to change?
Well, look, I think he is under huge pressure to deliver. There's always this balance between what people call values voters and valence voters. But in fact, as you say, the polling showed at the last election that even people who are aligned, or consider themselves aligned more with conservative values, felt that in administration at the end of 14 years, the party was not delivering and therefore was not, competent. And that's one of the key reasons they, received such a crushing verdict from the public and a huge defeat at the general election. So in that sense, pressure is on Keir Starmer. In addition, I think he knows that although on paper his majority looks huge, a lot of the seats he's won are by quite slim margins. So come the next election in just 5 years' time, he needs to prove he's delivered, and the race is on to get some of the most difficult subjects underway now and to spend some of his political capital while it's high. But it is a very difficult fiscal situation. We've already seen the political campaign begin by this government to sort of bring all the skeletons out of the closet and try and pin some of the worst situations like the prisons capacity crisis on the last Tory administration. We've heard from Keir Starmer say, that the prisons issue is worse than he realised while in opposition. And I think we'll be hearing a lot more about that in coming weeks. Rachel Reeves is going to bring forward this review of the party's spending inheritance that will do a lot of this legwork of trying to hold the last government responsible. And that could potentially pave the way for tax rises later this autumn, even though the government now pledged to, not increase taxes on working people and suggested that it had no plans for tax rises outside of the very narrow raft of measures it outlined in its manifesto. I think we could yet see them say, now we've seen under the bonnet and just how bad the situation is, we are going to have to raise revenue from somewhere.
Before we go on to the issues of foreign policy, Peter, I just got to ask you about Brexit, because it seems that the Labour Party has adopted sort of the same policy as the Conservatives, which is that they won't have another referendum, despite the polls suggesting that Brits would vote to go back into the EU. I mean, how much of an issue does Brexit remain?
Well, during the election campaign, Brexit was the dog that didn't bark. None of the political parties, even the Lib Dems, the Liberal Democrats, whose policy is to want to return to the European Union, really talked about Brexit at all. But it's a huge aspect of the economic situation that Britain is in. One of the reasons we've had such sluggish growth in the last few years is trade barriers. It's arguably the one lever that does exist that could be pulled to quickly increase GDP is a closer alignment with the European Union. That also comes with lots of difficulties. There's already been a Brexit deal, etc. I think what's going to be interesting to watch, at the moment, Labour doesn't really want to talk about it. It would be interesting if the Liberal Democrats were to become more vocally anti-Brexit. I think there's definitely a large percentage of Labour voters, and particularly Labour members, who are very agitated by Brexit still. So I think to think it's disappeared as an issue just because it doesn't really appear in the King's speech is to slightly misread what the reality that is still a massive issue of British politics, and it is kind of unresolved in many respects.
OK, Tim, what did appear, though, in the King's speech is that the UK wants better relations with the EU. But is it clear how far Labour is willing to go?
Well, it's pretty clear that they don't want to rejoin the single market or the customs union, which, as Peter said, would be the easiest way of getting growth in this country, because economists feel that that's probably cost us around 5% of our GDP. Keir Starmer and his Labour colleagues are obviously still very worried about losing people who voted leave in 2016 from this coalition that they built in 2024. So there's, I think, very little chance that we'll see that happening, at least in the first term of a Labour government. What Labour will try to do is to use the renegotiation of the trade and cooperation agreement that comes up for renegotiation in 2025 to try and, as it were, tinker at the edges and improve some part of our trading relationship with the European Union. I think we'll probably see agreements on veterinary issues, and that will help, I think, with the export and import of food, animals, plants, etc. That will help. We may see some moves towards what we call dynamic alignment. So that will be as the EU changes its regulatory rules in various areas, we will automatically change ours to harmonise with them and therefore make it easier for people exporting to the European Union. That will make a difference. But quite frankly, we are, if we don't rejoin the single market and we don't rejoin the customs union, going to be treated by the European Union as a third country with all the disadvantages and the friction that involves.
Okay, and on Ukraine, Lucy, I mean, do you see any difference or between the Conservatives and the Labour Party when it comes to Ukraine? We heard in the King's speech that, you know, Ukraine is hugely important, and we understand from this government that backing and arming Ukraine will continue.
I think that's the one kind of area of policy where Keir Starmer is really keen to stress continuity with his predecessor, Rishi Sunak. And he says that in pretty undisguised terms, that the UK remains foursquare behind Kyiv. They've committed to the same uplift in spending on military aid to Ukraine, $3 billion a year till 2030 that the Conservatives had. And certainly Starmer moved both before the election and after to personally reassure Volodymyr Zelensky, including at the NATO summit in Washington last week. So I think that's an area where we won't see any deviation. One question mark still remains over how long it will take this Labour government to increase defence expenditure to 2.5% of GDP. They've said they'll get there, and they have this week announced a major strategic defence review that will set out the roadmap for how they get there from the current level of defence spending, which is 2.3% GDP.
And of course, the other war is Gaza. Peter, what does this government mean for Israeli support and the war on Gaza? I mean, we did see that during the election they lost seats, and there's been a purge of Palestinian supporters from the Labour Party. As you know, we heard in our report that a number of ministers have actually received Israeli donations. This report claiming more than 40% of Keir Starmer's cabinet has been funded by pro-Israeli groups. So do you expect continuity there as well? When it comes to support for Israel, just like the Conservatives?
Well, in the King's speech, the Labour Party talked about wanting to facilitate peace in the Middle East and have a sovereign, independent Palestinian state. I think Keir Starmer and his senior ministers are very wary, especially politically, about what happened in the election. They were very slow to support a ceasefire. I think many of them now regret how slow they were to support a ceasefire in Gaza. The language from the Labour Party has changed. As your package showed, David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, was in Israel meeting Benjamin Netanyahu recently as well. I think they're trying now to try and kind of a little bit to try and stop some of the attacks on them from their left flank around Gaza.
But what we heard in the King's speech is nothing really new. I mean, that's been a long-standing UK policy, right? Support for the two-state solution and pursuing peace when it comes to Israel and Palestinians. So there was nothing new.
Not in the King's speech, which is not that surprising because the King's speech doesn't tend to deal with foreign policy issues. And so I think in that respect, it's not surprising. What the Labour Party will do that's new, I think, is still unclear. Will they look to recognise an independent Palestinian state now rather than after two-state solution, etc.? That's possibly one place where pressure will be applied.
Okay, and Tim, when it comes to transatlantic relations, relations with the US, I mean, does that depend not so much on actually who occupies 10 Downing Street, but who occupies the White House?
Spot on, yes. I mean, whatever Labour, for example, wants to do in terms of helping Ukraine is going to depend in the end on whether Donald Trump wins in the United States in November and decides whether or not to actually continue the US support for Ukraine. Without US support, British support and European support won't really mean a great deal. So the election in November in the United States of America is going to be incredibly important for UK foreign policy. Clearly, you'd have to say that Keir Starmer and Donald Trump are chalk and cheese. I think they act, think, and speak very, very differently. But obviously, a Labour government, as has happened before, is just going to have to deal with whoever they have to deal with in the White House. Whether they will still talk about a so-called special relationship were Donald Trump to win, well, we've yet to see.
Yeah, we will see that. Just final thoughts from the three of you on the same question. Lucy, I'll start with you. Where do you think this new government sees the UK's place in the world?
Well, certainly, Keir Starmer has said that UK is back. He wants it to play a bigger role on the world stage. And I think we will see the pace of travel from the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary step up and reflect that in coming months.
And Tim?
I think we will see Labour play more of a European role rather than repeating the ambitions that the Conservative government have to some sort of Indo-Pacific tilt. I think many people in the Labour Party see that as too ambitious. So I think they will play a big part, but it will be a regional role, if anything.
Peter, do you agree with that, or do you have any other thoughts?
No, I would echo that. I think it will be more of a European role. It depends what happens in the White House as well in November's election. And it also, to some degree, will also depend on what direction of travel European politics takes. As European politics moves further to the right, into the populist right, it's quite striking that Keir Starmer today talked about his King's speech as an antidote to populism. I think there could be tension in the future between, what could be populist and far-right governments in Europe and the British government.
And how do you think that he'll be able to handle that?
I think it's going to be tricky. I think, we've got senior Labour figures who have been actually very vocal against the populist right. Now you can see with regards to Donald Trump having to kind of backtrack quite a lot. I think it was Lucy, the story in the FT the other day, looking through the various comments that people like David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, and others had made about Donald Trump, none of which are very flattering. And there's going to be a lot of walking back on that. And I think similarly when it comes to Europe, I think it's going to put some challenge for this Labour government that wants to be seen as principled, wants to be seen, I think, in some respect as, if not leading a social democratic charge, at least occupying an anti-populist space when it's going to be butting up against populist governments.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us, Lucy Fisher, Tim Bale and Peter Geoghegan. We appreciate your time. Thank you. And thanks for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Join the conversation on X. Our handle is AJ Inside Story. For myself and the whole team here in Doha, thanks for watching and bye-bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.